incredibly bleak time in Israel's history. And as we know, the book of Ruth precedes it, the book of Judges precedes that, which gives us the context. This is a period in which everybody in Israel is doing what seems right to them. Israel is in deep moral and spiritual decline. Tabernacle worship is still happening, but it's far more tradition than real faith. And even the priests don't really believe and treat God with contempt. They steal from his sacrifices, steal from his people, sleep around with the serving girls. Good men like Eli fail to take any decisive action, and so evil prospers in God's land. The one spark in the dark is Samuel, who God has been preparing, but his story now goes onto the back burner because before mercy comes, there's got to be judgment. And God is going to bring his people even lower before he raises them up again. So Israel goes to battle with their nasty neighbors, the Philistines, and they're defeated. And the people panic. And so they take the Ark of the Covenant, the golden box that represents God's presence amongst his people, into the next fight. God hadn't told them to do that. It was their idea, their superstition, that led to that action. They thought, well, God's not going to allow us to be killed. He won't allow us to be defeated if the ark is with us. That's exactly what happens. The Philistines not only win, but they kill the priests. They capture the ark. Chapter 4 ends with the birth of the very last surviving member of the priest's family, a little boy being born. And his name is "The Glory Has Left Israel." 1 to 4 is this downward slope. It's getting bleaker and bleaker and bleaker. It's a slide into total disaster. And chapter 5 then begins with Israel in disarray. The priesthood is gone. It's in tatters. The ark has been taken away. It couldn't get any worse. It looks like God's plan for a promised land people is over. And now things change. God takes his people right to the bottom of the valley before he brings them up the other side. And the climb out isn't going to be easy either. It starts with understanding some vital things about who God is. See, Christians always get into real trouble when we forget who God is. And things don't get better for us until we stop and go back to that fundamental reality. Who is our God? They don't get better until we remember. The first lesson that Israel needs to learn then is that lesson that I said is the big principle we've got to take home tonight. God does not need you. I think it's the most eccentric teachers in high school that live the longest in your memory. I saw a website that was asking people to write in about the strangest teachers that they had, and the one that won it for me was this girl had written in about a woodwork teacher that she'd had. I don't know if it runs in the blood, Phil. I know you do a bit of woodwork over there, but this guy, this is what not to do. This guy apparently in one lesson he'd eaten chalk, in another lesson he'd drunk wood glue, and he finally got fired from the school, went on a snow day, so I assumed that none of the kids were there. He'd been riding around the school grounds naked on his motorcycle. Now that guy should probably have never been teaching in the first place, but I bet his students remember his lessons. In chapter 5, God is teaching the world, his people especially, and us tonight, through a very strange teacher. It's the Philistines. It's his enemies. They've captured the ark, and verse 1, they take it like a trophy into the temple of Dagon in the city of Ashdod, about 35 miles west of Jerusalem. And you see what's being said there. There's two things being said. One, well, we'll take this God and we'll add it to our collection of gods in Dagon's temple, but it's going to be in Dagon's temple. So the big thing we want the world to see is we've beaten this God. Dagon has triumphed over this God. Our God has beat your God, and we're keeping his golden box right here to prove that Dagon is the greatest. But verse 3, in the morning, as the people go to sacrifice, they find Dagon's statue lying face down, eating dust in front of the ark. So they quickly put Dagon's statue back in place, and don't miss the biting humor. Some of you actually laughed, which is great, because you must have an Old Testament Israeli heart, because you're meant to laugh when you read verse 3. Don't miss that stinging humor. Here's Dagon. He's the god of the Philistines. He's conquered Israel's God. Nobody dare question or challenge Dagon. But if you could all cover your eyes while we quickly prop him back up in his place, because he's fallen over in the night, while we help him up like a cast sheep. It's kind of like when Dorothy's dog, in The Wizard of Oz, when little Toto grabs the curtain that the old man with the levers is hiding behind, pretending to be Oz, the great and powerful wizard, and the dog's pulling the curtain back, and he's like, oh, don't look at me, and he's trying to hide the fact, and we all laugh because these great claims of power and strength all come crashing down, and it reveals that there's nothing there. If Dagon needs people to put him in his place, if he needs people to pick him up and put him back, how can he be God? Verse 4, it gets worse for Dagon. The next morning, the statue's broken. And so Dagon doesn't need to be replaced. He needs to be removed and repaired. And forever afterwards, the priests are going to do this superstitious little skip over the threshold. It's embarrassing, isn't it? Mummy, why the priests do that funny little jump over the threshold when they go into for years afterwards, all the Philistine kids are going to be watching these priests saying, why do they do that? Well, that's because when we brought the ark of Yahweh into the temple, Dagon collapsed and his head and his hands came off and they were left there. And they're going to have to, it's awful for the worshippers of Dagon. It must have shaken the people of Ashdod. I mean, the Philistines had won, hadn't they? Dagon was victorious. And yet when everything appears to be going Dagon's way, he's got nothing. Israel was defeated. The ark is captured. God and his purposes appear lost. And yet he is supreme. I want you to, that's the word that I want to be singing in our hearts as we leave this evening. As we think about God, if we remember nothing else, let that be the word in our hearts, in our minds, as we think about God. Supreme. I want you to see three facets of God's supremacy. Number one, God is supreme because his power is unquestionable. Many of you have seen the movie Gladiator, one of Sarah's favorite films. There's a scene when one of the Roman senators is giving advice to the emperor, and he talks about this sea snake that pretends to be dead. It draws in its prey by pretending to be dead, and it looks lifeless as it sits at the bottom of the ocean. It's far more dramatic, it's all candlelight and then us in a bright room, he's talking about this sea snake, and it lies lifeless, motionless at the bottom of the ocean, so that its prey comes in thinking it's dead, thinking it's going to get an easy feed, and it will even allow its prey to take little bites out of it, so it feels safe before suddenly striking and showing that it is full of life and is dangerous. The Philistines have defeated Israel, but they've defeated Israel for one reason, not because they're greater or stronger or anything like that. One reason: God has allowed them to. And they've captured the ark for one reason: God has allowed them to. And they take little bites out of Yahweh's reputation because God allows them to. And then comes a point, right, when God's enemies think that they've got him, that they can carry his presence and his ark into their temple and stick it there as a little trophy for everyone to see how great they are and how great their God is. And he strikes and he shows them real power and he humbles his enemies. God loves to do this, and we rejoice in it. He loves to show the world how powerful he is by allowing his enemies to do all that they can. He lets them flex their muscles and launch the full payload of their fury before he strikes back. We see that most clearly of all at the cross, don't we? Most profound display of God's power when all of hell is let loose against Jesus, when Satan exhausts all of his malice on Christ only for him to come back from the dead. Satan's done it. It's finished. The job's done. He's dead. It's over. There's no way. He can snatch victory out of this defeat, and then 3 days later, the stones rolled away, the grave clothes are left behind. There's not going to be a thing of death about Jesus as he marches out victorious. And behind him, with him, are going to come all of these captives of his that once belonged to Satan. He's going to rescue millions out of his kingdom and bring them into his own. It gives us great hope for God's glory in New Zealand. When we think about this, there are some of you here who are a little bit older than others of us, and you've watched the deterioration of the church in our country. You've seen congregations and even denominations fall apart or being emasculated by spineless liberalism. Don't think for 1 minute that God and his purposes are being defeated here. Don't be embarrassed that modern day Philistines are celebrating having devoted the ark of God as a trophy to secular humanism. They say, we've done it. We've outgrown the morality of the church. We're so much smarter than these Bronze Age believing Christians. It's only a matter of time. Only time before God in grace strikes, in judgment strikes, and humbles his enemies, brings honor to his name. Facet number 2, God is supreme because his glory is unshareable. Numbers chapter 25 and verse 11 tells us that God is jealous for his glory. He will not share it with another. And so when the Philistines park the ark in Dagon's temple, and in their heads and in their hearts do what they've done physically and put God beside Dagon. You notice that word, it's significant, isn't it? As we read it earlier in verse 2. Into the house of Dagon and set it up where? Beside Dagon. They're still going to show it some respect. I mean, he's still a god after all. He's not as big a deal as Dagon, but we'll put him up there. He can be another god beside Dagon. They put him there as if he's in the same category as Dagon, the same ballpark as Dagon. He will not tolerate it. God says, no way. And before 24 hours pass, Dagon is brought crashing down. If you go into the pet shop, you'll see tanks full of different fish. But you'll also see these tiny little tanks with what are called beta or Siamese fighting fish. I think that's a much cooler name for them. If I was one of them, I'd want to be known by that name. But little tanks with Siamese fighting fish in. And the reason they get their own little tanks, the clue's in the name, the males fight. They're massively territorial, and so if any other fish is in their space, they will not tolerate it. They will go for it. Our God will not share a temple. He will not share a heart with any other God. To set up another God beside him is to stoke the furnace of his jealous wrath. Now you think for a moment about the offense that idolatry is. With idolatry, you're saying God is no better than a made-up deity. He's the uncreated, all-powerful God who called everything into being and maintains the universe by the power of his word, and you're saying, by putting him there next to other gods, he's no more than an invention. He's no better, no greater, no less than an invention of a man's mind. This is the God who wove the synapses of the human brain together. With a word, he spoke. He creates Adam out of dust, makes a man out of nothing. And you're saying that he's the product of the thing that he made? It's grossly offensive. It would be like me going home tonight and saying, Sarah, I've fallen in love with another woman. And the next day she sees me walking down the road, holding hands with a cardboard cutout of Minnie Mouse. What should she do with that cardboard cutout? She should rip it out of my hand. She should pulp it and feed it to me. That's what she should do. What an insult. To say that my wife is no better than a lifeless, man-made drawing. That's what idolatry is. So every single one of us tonight needs to run very quickly into the temple of our hearts and ask, is there anything in here apart from Jesus? Have I erected anything else in my life as an object of worship apart from Jesus? When you came to faith in Jesus, did you bring him into an already occupied temple? A temple that's already occupied by another god. Hindus, Buddhists, those who are influenced by the New Age, they all try that. Jesus is to be one amongst many other sources of inspiration. Jesus is just one other holy teacher who's got some things to add, got some great things to say, but you can bring him in and he can share the room with all the other rabbis and influential thinkers who've got good things to add to your life. This passage is bad news for you. There's going to be a royal rumble in your heart, because the one true God will not share the podium. It's his. The whole temple is his. You want to add the Good Shepherd to your list of gurus? The first thing the Good Shepherd says to you is tear up the list. All those other names, he says, all who came before me are thieves and robbers. But the sheep did not listen to them. My people, my true sheep, they won't listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved. He will go in and out and find pasture. Thief comes only to kill and destroy. I came that you may have life, have it to the full. I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. You hear what Jesus is saying there? You want to put me on a list with all these other people? The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. You want to add me to the list of these people because you think I'm just another person who's got good things to say. You look at my cross and you tell me that. Did any of those others do this for you? Did they love you like I love you? Dagon can't free you from hell, and neither can Darwin. Muhammad can't save your soul. Joseph Smith, Ron Hubbard, they didn't lay down their life for you. They didn't become the focus, the sole focus of all of God's wrath for you. And me, having done all that, having shown such love for you, you want me to stand in the queue with them? No, says Jesus, mine the glory and the crown, the high renown, the eternal name. And when our hearts are right, they cry out, oh, not unto us then. And not to Muhammad, and not to Joseph Smith, not to anyone else, oh Lord, but to your name. Your name be the glory. That's where it belongs. You're the King. You're the one true and living God. And when you make that search of the temple of your heart, don't stop at the obvious. It's the subtle gods that have so many kiwis wrapped around their fingers, isn't it? It's the subtle idols that creep in. The idol farm, and the idol family, and reputation and comfort. We make gods out of these things so quickly. You try and live your life for those. It's only going to be a matter of time when, like Dagon's statue, Jesus pulls it down. He'll look you in the eye and you say, I didn't go to the cross for you so you could split your love between me and a farm, between me and people, as wonderful as they are. These are gifts from my hand. You're going to love the gifts as much as you love the giver. Jesus fought for you, Christian, when he fought Satan to rescue you out of his kingdom. Don't make him compete for your affections now that he's done that for you, now that he's saved your soul. Number 3, God is supreme because his wisdom destroys all other wisdom. We could miss this, but if we take a little step back from the passage and look beyond the idol in the temple, look beyond the statue of Dagon to what it represents, there's a sweetness that will encourage our hearts. See, Dagon, that statue standing in that temple, is a product of a worldview. He's not there just because he's always been there. He's an invention of a man and their mind. And so he's the product of a worldview called paganism. This is the most common kind of thinking outside of Israel in the ancient world. And so you think of Israel as this kind of isolated little island, an oasis of truth. and real spirituality. Obviously things aren't good in this passage, but that's how it's meant to be. And then all around we've just got this dark paganism going on. Paganism, the worship of often many gods, and them doing different things. Like in Dagon's case, we think he's probably a god to do with the growth of plants and crops. And you know, the similar thing that happened all through the ancient world. So here's Dagon, and that's why he's there. He's a product of this worldview called paganism. This is the worldview of the age. Outside of Israel, this is how people think. Now, what happened when God came close? What happened when God's presence is brought into the pagan temple? It collapses. It comes down. And what is going to defeat the wisdom of our age? What can break through the monolithic, because it is when we look at it, when we look out into we see the news, we see what's online, when we look at the monolithic power of secular pluralism and postmodernism and the iron grip that it has on Western culture, what is going to break that? One thing. The exact same thing that shattered paganism here. See, secular pluralism, postmodernism will come crashing down when God comes near. And he's promised us that exact thing. For it is written, 1 Corinthians 1:19, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. If you want to see the wisdom of this age crumble like Dagon's statue, bring God's wisdom near. Take the Lord Jesus out into that world. Confront the world's thinking with him. And I'm not talking about apologetics here. Apologetics have a place, especially for encouraging Christians. But presenting an argument that's more compelling than the arguments of the worlds around us is not the way, because you can't reason somebody out of something they've never been reasoned into in the first place. That's important. You can't reason someone out of something they haven't been reasoned into in the first place. And as much as the world might like to think that pluralism and postmodernism are intellectually robust, why they might like to think it's the best arguments the world has to offer, that's not the reason that people believe those things. People want to believe that secular pluralism, everybody is right in their own way, that everybody's view has got something to contribute, that nobody's really wrong. People want to believe that because it means that I'm not wrong. It's comfortable to believe it. We believe it because we want to. And people want to believe postmodernism, that there's no ultimate truth, because then there's no ultimate God to be accountable to at the end of the day. And we can believe and we can behave however we want to behave. Now, apologetics, clever arguments aren't going to change that, but God can. God can. God can conquer the most resistant heart, and he does it the same way that he always has, through the gospel. The wonderful, simple, offensively simple to the world message of his saving grace to an undeserving world of sinners through his Son, Jesus. How is God going to destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent frustrate? For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, what's the power of God? What's the message of the cross? Well, it really centers on the same truth, the same ultimatum that we see in these verses. It sounds like this: worship God or be destroyed. It sounds so uncompromising. But in light of what we've seen of who God is, his supremacy, does it surprise us at all that that God would deal in absolutes? Look back at the text. The first time that Dagon fell prostrate, he fell prostrate before the ark. The passage tells that, verse 3. Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground. Why do you think it makes that point, that the idol wasn't lying on its side or on its back? It's face downward before the ark. Dagon's there in a position of worship before the ark of God. But the Philistines prop him back up again, so the following night, the idol's destroyed. If Dagon would not worship, he would be gone. He would face the judgment of God. And his hands are cut off because there's nothing he can do about it. And his head's cut off because there's nothing he can say against it. God gave a powerful warning then to the Philistines. Do you see something of God's grace there to the Philistines? He's warning them. He's giving this message. This is what will happen to those who won't repent and come to faith in him. If you will not worship, you will be destroyed. And there's nothing you can do or say against it. He is the supreme God. Now, the warning for me and you is far more powerful than a collapsing idol. Our warning is a cross, where God did to Jesus what he will do to everybody who doesn't repent and believe on him. That's the message of the cross. If you will not worship, if you will not come to Jesus and say, you are Lord, and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you can't be saved. You'll be destroyed. But if you will believe on Jesus, he'd take that destruction that you should suffer, the judgment that you should face, and in place of your sin, give you his perfect righteousness. The last thing I want to say to you then is that God does not need you. I was just thinking as I was praying before I stood up, there's not many churches that you'd hear that, are there? That would be the theme of the sermon. God doesn't need you, people. There's certainly not many mega churches and prosperity churches where the point of the sermon is God doesn't need you. This is the big lesson of the text. We can't get away from it. Just see it here, just simple overview of the passage. There are no Israelites cheering on God. There's nobody fighting for God's honor. There's nobody wrestling to get the ark back. There's no special forces coming in through the window of Dagon's temple to drag the ark back to the tabernacle. There's nobody to be the hands and feet of God like all the sermons tell us that we are. And yet all alone in a foreign land with no help from anybody, God defies the wisdom of the Philistines and he brings their God to nothing. God doesn't need anyone. And we must not dilute the awesomeness of God as we've seen him tonight by believing that if God didn't have his church, he couldn't achieve his purposes in the world. And we say, but I'm really glad, Mike, that you didn't just call us all when you were talking about open doors about, you need to be the hands and feet of Jesus in helping these. I was a little bit nervous that you might have said something along those lines, but you didn't. And so everything has come together beautifully in God's providence. People might ask that though, who's going to do this mission? Who's going to support our persecuted brothers? Who's going to go to the Ukraine to preach the gospel to? Who's going to go to Afghanistan? Who's going to go to the Central African Republic? North Korea? Who would dream? It's impossible. Who's going to do God's mission of making disciples if it's not us? What did Jesus say? Matthew 3:9, I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children for Abraham. It's pretty debilitating, isn't it? If God wants to, he can turn stones into believers for him. What? God does not need us. And we must not be afraid of teaching that holds God in a lofty place, high above this world and everything in it. Don't be afraid of teaching that truly exalts the God of heaven. What I long to do this evening is present to you God as he is, a big God and a splendid God, majestic God, a God who's altogether other from us and the world in which we live. He is mind-blowingly awesome beyond your comprehension. Of course he doesn't need you. But, you ready for this? He wants you. Same God. He wants you. When Daniel's at preschool, he needs his teachers. But when Sarah collects him, he smiles and he runs to her because he wants his mum. When an old lady falls and breaks her hip, she needs the surgeon. But she wants her husband to be there and hold her hand. When the farmer asks his little boy, you want to come and help me chop wood? Doesn't need him. Probably be faster without him. But he wants him there because he loves him. Daniel doesn't love his teachers, he loves his mum. Lady doesn't love the nurse, surgeon, she loves her husband. The farmer loves his boy. And you are wanted by this awesome, frighteningly wonderful, supreme God, because he loves